Sometimes the most broken vessels carry the most precious gifts. The narrow alleyways of Jerusalem's old city echoed with the sound of Maya's worn sneakers splashing through puddles, her stomach gnawing with a hunger that had become her constant companion. For 3 years, she'd survived by turning garbage into gold, transforming discarded vegetables and stale bread into meals that somehow filled more than just empty bellies. People whispered that her food carried healing, but Maya knew better than to believe in miracles. That changed the night she met Emmanuel. Standing beneath a flickering streetlight, this carpenter with calloused hands and eyes older than time itself looked at her offering, a pathetic soup made from scraps, and spoke words that shattered her understanding of everything. What happened next violated every law of physics, every principle of reality, and left an entire crowd of witnesses questioning whether they'd just experienced the impossible. But the real mystery wasn't the multiplication of her meager meal. It was how this stranger knew about the fire, about her family, about the guilt that haunted her dreams. Who was Emmanuel really? And why did his presence awaken memories of a voice she'd heard calling her name since she was a child? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya's fingers trembled as she clutched the ceramic bowl, its chipped edges cutting into her palms. The crowd pressed closer, their faces illuminated by the pale glow of Emmanuel's lantern, eyes wide with disbelief. Where moments before she'd ladled thin, watery broth made from wilted cabbage leaves and day-old bread crusts, now thick, golden soup filled bowl after bowl without ever emptying. "Impossible," whispered Mrs. Goldstein, the elderly shopkeeper who usually chased Maya away from her dumpster. She held her portion with shaking hands, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "It tastes like my grandmother's recipe, but how could you know?" Maya couldn't answer because she didn't know. The soup had transformed under Emmanuel's touch, becoming something that seemed to reach into each person's memory and pull forth their deepest comfort. She watched a young mother's haunted expression soften as she fed spoonfuls to her crying infant. A grizzled construction worker sat quietly weeping as he ate, the hard lines around his eyes smoothing with each bite. "You've done this before," Emmanuel said quietly, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. It wasn't a question. Maya's throat constricted. She wanted to deny it, to run as she always did when people started asking questions. But those eyes, dark as ancient wells and somehow familiar, held her captive. "Not like this. Never like this. But you fed people. Many people." He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of sawdust and something else, something that reminded her of her mother's garden before the fire consumed it all. "Even when you had nothing to give." The memory hit her like a physical blow. 3 months ago, during the Feast of Sukkot, she'd found a family of refugees huddled in the abandoned building where she sometimes slept. The children were skeletal, their mother hollow-eyed with desperation. Maya had given them her last can of beans and a handful of crackers she'd been saving. Somehow, that simple meal had stretched to feed all 5 of them, leaving everyone satisfied in a way that defied the meager portions. She'd convinced herself it was just careful rationing, that hunger had made her misjudge the quantities, but deep down she'd known it was something else. Something that had been happening since she was 14 and first found herself alone on the streets. "Who are you?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Emmanuel smiled, and for a moment the dim alley seemed to brighten. "I think you already know, Maya." Her name on his lips sent electricity down her spine. She'd never told him her name. In 3 years of carefully guarded anonymity, she'd never let that slip to a stranger. "How do you—" "The fire wasn't your fault." The words hit her like ice water, stealing her breath. The bowl slipped from her nerveless fingers, but Emmanuel caught it before it could shatter on the wet pavement. Around them, the crowd continued eating, their conversations a distant hum, as if she and Emmanuel existed in their own pocket of reality. "You don't know anything about me," she whispered, backing away until her shoulders hit the rough stone wall behind her. "I know you were 12 when it happened. I know you blamed yourself for falling asleep while babysitting your younger brother. I know you've carried his name in your heart every day since then, and that you cook for others because you couldn't save him." "Stop!" The word came out broken, barely audible. Her chest felt like it was collapsing inward, the familiar weight of grief and guilt crushing her lungs. "Please, just stop." But Emmanuel's voice was gentle, relentless. "I know you pray to a God you're not sure is listening. And I know you've heard a voice calling your name in your dreams, a voice that sounds like yours," she finished, the admission torn from somewhere deep inside her. The carpenter nodded slowly. "You've been waiting for answers, Maya. Tonight you'll begin to find them." A sudden gust of wind swept through the alley, extinguishing several candles and setting the hanging laundry dancing like ghostly figures. When the air settled, Maya noticed that the crowd had begun to disperse, people drifting away with expressions of wonder and contentment, their empty bowls stacked neatly beside Emmanuel's feet. Every bowl was empty, yet somehow Maya's original pot still held soup, steam rising from its surface despite the winter cold. "This is impossible," she breathed. "So was feeding 5,000 with a few loaves and fishes," Emmanuel replied. "So was turning water into wine at a wedding feast. So was loving the world enough to—" He stopped himself, but the words hung in the air like incense, heavy with implication. Maya's mind reeled, caught between disbelief and a recognition so deep it felt carved into her bones. The voice from her dreams, the one that had whispered comfort through her darkest nights, the one that had guided her hands as she cooked for the forgotten and forsaken. It had always been preparing her for this moment. For him. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the first drops of rain began to fall. The rain began as a whisper, then crescendoed into a symphony of drops against stone and metal. Maya stood frozen against the wall, watching as Emmanuel gathered the empty bowls with movements that seemed almost ritualistic. Each ceramic vessel clinked softly as he stacked them, the sound oddly musical despite the growing storm. "You should go," she said, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Find shelter." Emmanuel looked up at her, water already darkening his hair. "Where do you go when storms come?" The question hit differently than his earlier pronouncements about her past. This wasn't about supernatural knowledge. This was about the brutal practicality of survival that had defined her existence for 3 years. Maya pulled her threadbare jacket tighter, feeling the familiar weight of resignation settle over her shoulders. "There's an old loading dock about 6 blocks from here," she heard herself saying, "part of a warehouse that burned out last spring. The roof still covers maybe half the space. Show me." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't a command either. Something in between that made her feet start moving before her mind could protest. As they hurried through the increasingly heavy downpour, Maya's thoughts churned like the dark clouds above. The loading dock had been her sanctuary for 8 months now, ever since Mrs. Chen had discovered her sleeping in the storeroom behind the noodle shop and threatened to call social services. Maya had learned to be grateful for the concrete overhang that kept most of the rain out, for the metal shipping containers that blocked the worst of the winter wind. She'd arranged discarded cardboard to create a makeshift floor and salvaged a torn tarp that served as both blanket and privacy screen. It wasn't much, but it was hers. The first space that had felt remotely like home since the fire. "This is it," she said as they ducked under the overhang. She immediately busied herself with her evening routine, checking the cardboard for dampness, repositioning her few possessions away from the areas where rain tended to blow in, lighting the small candle she kept in a glass jar for emergencies. Emmanuel surveyed the space without judgment, his presence somehow making the concrete and rust feel less desolate. "You've been here a while." "Long enough." Maya settled cross-legged on her cardboard mat, gesturing to a relatively dry section of concrete near her. "Longer than most places. Usually something happens. Police sweeps, property owners, other homeless people who don't like sharing space. But this place," she shrugged, It's like it's forgotten by the world, or protected by it. The words sent an odd shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cold. Maya studied his face in the candlelight, looking for some sign that he was mocking her, but found only that same unsettling gentleness that had undone her in the alley. Every morning, she continued, needing to fill the silence with normalcy, I check the dumpsters behind the market. Best time is around 7. After the night vendors throw out what didn't sell, but before the garbage trucks come. Then I hit the bakery on Ben Yehuda Street. The owner's son sometimes leaves day-old bread by the back door. She was rambling now, but couldn't stop. Afternoons, I usually find a corner somewhere and cook. People are more generous when they can smell food, even if it's just onion soup made from scraps. And the cooking, it helps. Makes me feel like I'm doing something useful instead of just surviving. You feed others before you feed yourself. It wasn't a question, but Maya nodded anyway. There's always someone worse off, always someone hungrier, someone with kids or sickness or... She trailed off, realizing how ridiculous it sounded. Here she was, homeless and alone, talking about people worse off than her. Your brother would be proud. The words hit like a physical blow. Maya's hand went instinctively to the small silver locket she wore beneath her shirt, the only thing that had survived the fire, containing David's last school picture. She'd never told anyone about it, never let anyone see it. You don't know what David would think, she whispered. I know he loved your cooking. I know he used to sneak into the kitchen when your mother wasn't looking and help you stir the soup pot, standing on that blue step stool your father built. Maya's breath caught. The blue step stool. She hadn't thought about that in years, how David would drag it across the linoleum, the scraping sound it made, how he'd beam with pride when she let him help. No one else would remember that detail. No one else had been there. Outside, the storm intensified, rain drumming against the metal containers like urgent fingers. But inside their small circle of candlelight, the air felt charged with something else entirely, something that made Maya's skin prickle with recognition and fear. Who are you really? She asked again, though part of her was terrified of the answer. Emmanuel leaned forward slightly, and in the flickering flame, his face seemed to shimmer between familiar and impossible. I'm someone who's been watching over you longer than you know, Maya, and I'm someone who needs your help. Maya's heart hammered against her ribs. You need my help? The words came out as a croak, disbelief making her voice thin. I'm nobody. I have nothing. Emmanuel's eyes never left hers. Tomorrow morning, there will be people waiting for you at the market square, hundreds of them. They'll come because word is already spreading about what happened tonight, about the soup that tasted like home, about the girl who fed a crowd from scraps. That wasn't me, that was... Maya gestured helplessly at him. Whatever you did, however you changed it. The miracle began with your hands, Maya. Your willingness to give what little you had. He paused, rain continuing its relentless percussion on the metal around them. But tomorrow will be different. Tomorrow there will be reporters, police, government officials who want to understand what happened. And there will be others, people with darker intentions who see opportunity in miracles. A chill ran down Maya's spine that had nothing to do with the weather. She'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisibility, of moving through the city's shadows without drawing attention. The idea of crowds, of cameras, of people asking questions about her past made her stomach clench with panic. I can't, she whispered. I won't. I'll find somewhere else to go, somewhere they can't. They'll find you. Emmanuel's voice was gentle but certain. What happened tonight can't be undone or hidden, but you have a choice in what happens next. Maya pulled her knees to her chest, making herself as small as possible. What choice? Run or get dragged into something I don't understand? Stay and let me teach you to understand it. The words hung between them, like a bridge she wasn't sure she was brave enough to cross. Outside, lightning illuminated the loading dock in stark white relief, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the concrete beneath them. Teach me what? Who you really are. Why your hands can transform simple ingredients into something that heals hearts as well as hunger. Why you survived the fire when... He stopped, seeing her flinch. Why you've been having the dreams since you were a child. Maya's breath caught. The dreams, visions really, that had plagued her sleep for as long as she could remember. Images of a great feast, tables stretching endlessly under starlit skies, and always that voice calling her name, telling her she was loved, that she had purpose. She'd never told anyone about them, had convinced herself they were just her mind's way of coping with loss and loneliness. How do you know about the dreams? Because I gave them to you. Emmanuel shifted closer, and she could see ancient sadness mixed with infinite compassion in his eyes. They were meant to prepare you for this moment, for the choice you have to make now. What choice? The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with frustration and fear. Come with me. Learn what you're truly capable of. Help me feed not just their bodies but their souls, the way you've been doing without realizing it every time you've cooked for someone in need. He paused, studying her face. Or walk away. Disappear into the city again, try to forget this night ever happened, and spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been. Maya stared at him, her mind racing. Everything logical screamed at her to run. This stranger, no matter how impossibly he seemed to know her, was offering to upend the small, carefully controlled existence she'd built from the ashes of her old life. The street was brutal, but it was predictable. She knew its rules, its dangers, its rhythm. But those eyes that had been looking back at her from her dreams since she was 8 years old, that had whispered comfort through her darkest nights after David died, that had somehow guided her hands every time she'd turned scraps into meals that mysteriously fed more people than they should have. If I say yes, she whispered, there's no going back, is there? There's no going back to who you were before tonight, regardless, Emmanuel replied. The only question is whether you'll become who you're meant to be or spend your life running from it. Lightning flashed again, closer this time, and in that moment of blazing illumination, Maya saw something that made her gasp. For just an instant, Emmanuel's face was overlaid with another image, ancient, radiant, crowned with thorns, yet somehow beautiful beyond description. Then darkness returned, leaving only the gentle carpenter sitting across from her in the candlelight. But she'd seen enough. Her soul recognized what her mind was still struggling to accept. The people tomorrow, she said slowly, they won't just want food, will they? No, they'll want hope, healing, answers to questions they didn't even know they were carrying. Emmanuel's voice was soft as prayer. And you, Maya Ashworth, are going to help me give it to them. Maya closed her eyes, feeling the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders like a mantle. When she opened them again, her voice was steady despite the terror and wonder warring in her chest. Then I guess we'd better figure out how to feed them. The words hung in the air between them, and Maya immediately wanted to take them back. What had she just agreed to? Her hands trembled as she pulled her jacket tighter, the magnitude of her commitment crashing over her like the storm raging outside their shelter. Wait, she said, her voice cracking. Wait, I don't know what I'm saying. I'm just some homeless girl who gets lucky sometimes with cooking. I can't be whatever you think I am. Emmanuel remained perfectly still, watching her with that unsettling patience that made her feel simultaneously seen and exposed. The candle flame danced between them, casting shadows that seemed to writhe with her mounting panic. You saw something in the lightning, she whispered. Something impossible. But that doesn't mean I'm ready for this. I don't even know what this is. The carpenter leaned back slightly, giving her space to breathe. Tell me what you're afraid of, Maya. Everything, she wanted to scream. Instead, she forced herself to think, to articulate the terror clawing at her chest. They'll ask questions about where I came from, who my family was, why I'm on the streets, and when they can't find records, when they start digging. She swallowed hard. I've been using false names for 3 years, stealing when I had to, sleeping in places I wasn't supposed to be. They could lock me up, or send you back to the system. The words hit like ice water. Maya's last foster placement had ended 6 months before she aged out, a house where the father's wandering hands had made sleep impossible and meals were rationed as punishment for the smallest infractions. She'd run rather than endure another placement, choosing the uncertain dangers of the street over the known horrors of that system. "I won't go back," she said fiercely. "I won't let them put me in another house where—" She stopped herself, realizing she was revealing too much. But Emmanuel's expression didn't change, holding only compassion. "No one will force you anywhere you don't want to go. You can't promise that. You don't know how these things work." Maya stood abruptly, pacing the small, dry area of the loading dock. "Social services, reporters, police, they don't care about what I want. They see a miner living on the streets performing miracles, and suddenly I'm either a victim to be saved or a fraud to be exposed." Thunder crashed overhead, and she flinched despite herself. The sound always reminded her of that night 5 years ago. The way the house had groaned and collapsed, the roar of flames consuming everything she'd ever loved. "I barely survived the last time people paid attention to me," she continued, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The investigators, the court hearings, everyone wanting to know how the fire started, why I made it out when David didn't, and now you want me to step into a spotlight again." Emmanuel's voice was gentle when he spoke. "The fire investigators cleared you of any wrongdoing. Legally, maybe." Maya wrapped her arms around herself. "But I know the truth. I fell asleep watching him. If I'd stayed awake, if I'd smelled the smoke sooner, if I'd grabbed him first instead of running—" "You were 12 years old." "I was supposed to take care of him." The words exploded out of her, 3 years of suppressed anguish finally finding voice. "He was only 6, and he trusted me to keep him safe, and I failed. That's who I really am. Not some miracle worker, not someone special. I'm the girl who let her little brother burn." The confession left her hollow, trembling with more than cold. She'd never said those words aloud before, had carried that guilt like a stone in her chest every day since the fire. Emmanuel stood slowly, his movement careful and deliberate. "David loved you." "Don't." Maya's voice broke. "Don't talk about him like you knew him. He loved your laugh, how it sounded like wind chimes when something truly delighted you. He loved the way you'd sneak him extra cookies when your mother wasn't looking, and he loved how you'd make up stories when he had nightmares, about brave princesses who cooked magical feasts that could heal any sorrow." Maya's breath caught. Those stories, she'd forgotten about them until this moment, how David would curl up against her after a bad dream, begging for just one more tale about Princess Maya and her enchanted kitchen. "He wouldn't blame you for surviving," Emmanuel continued. "He'd want you to live, to use the gifts you've been given to help others the way you always helped him." "What if I can't?" The question came out small, defeated. "What if whatever happened tonight was just, I don't know, a fluke? What if tomorrow I try to cook and it's just ordinary food again? What if I disappoint all those people you say will be waiting?" Emmanuel smiled then, sad and knowing. "What if you don't?" The simple question hung between them as the storm began to ease, rain gentling from torrent to steady patter. Maya stared into the candle flame, seeing her own fear reflected in its wavering light. Maya sat in the growing quiet, watching raindrops slow their relentless percussion against the metal containers. The candle flame had steadied now, casting unwavering light across Emmanuel's patient face as he waited for her answer. "What if you don't?" The question echoed in her mind like a prayer she'd never dared speak. For 3 years, she'd lived in the shadow of what-ifs. What if she'd been faster, braver, better? What if she'd saved David? What if her parents hadn't died in that fire? But this was different. This what-if pointed toward possibility instead of regret. She thought of the crowd tonight, how their faces had transformed as they ate. Not just satisfaction from hunger being fed, but something deeper. Recognition, hope, the kind of healing she'd only dreamed about in those strange visions that had haunted her sleep. "The stories I told David," she said slowly, her voice barely audible above the gentling rain, "about Princess Maya and her enchanted kitchen. He used to ask if they were real. What did you tell him?" that someday they would be. The memory surfaced with startling clarity, David's earnest 6-year-old face looking up at her in the darkness of their shared bedroom, his small hand clutched in hers. I promised him that someday I'd cook feasts that could really heal people's hurts, that I'd feed anyone who was hungry and they'd leave feeling loved. Emmanuel leaned forward slightly. And he said he'd help me, that we'd do it together, the princess and her brave knight. Maya's throat constricted, but then the fire... She stopped, unable to finish. The fire didn't end the story, Maya. It changed it. She looked up sharply. How can you say that? David's gone. The promise is broken. Is it? Emmanuel's eyes held depths she couldn't fathom. Tonight, when you ladled that soup, when you saw those faces light up with something they'd forgotten they were missing, what did that feel like? Maya closed her eyes, remembering. The elderly woman who'd wept after her first spoonful, whispering that it tasted like her grandmother's kitchen. The teenage boy who'd been suspicious and hostile until the food touched his lips, then sat down heavily as if a weight he'd been carrying for years had suddenly lifted. The businessman in his wrinkled suit who'd eaten in reverent silence, then whispered, "Thank you," with tears streaming down his face. It felt like... She struggled to find words, like coming home, like every meal I'd ever cooked on the streets was practice for that moment, like David was there with me helping stir the pot, because he was. The certainty in Emmanuel's voice made her open her eyes. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, ancient sadness mixed with infinite love, as if he'd been waiting centuries for this moment. The gift you have, he continued, it didn't begin tonight. You've been healing people with your cooking for years, one bowl at a time, one hungry soul at a time. You've been keeping that promise to David every single day. Maya felt something shift inside her chest, like a door she'd kept bolted shut beginning to crack open. But tomorrow will be different, bigger, yes. Tomorrow you'll stop hiding from who you're meant to be. The rain had stopped entirely now. In the sudden silence, Maya could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of the choice pressing down on her like the storm clouds that were finally beginning to break apart above them. She thought of her cardboard mattress, her careful routines, the small, safe life she'd built in the margins of the city. Then she thought of the faces in the crowd tonight, of the inexplicable joy that had spread from person to person as they shared what should have been impossible, a feast born from scraps, love made manifest in simple soup. If I do this, she said quietly, if I say yes to whatever's coming tomorrow, I can't go back to being invisible. I can't pretend I'm just another homeless girl getting by on luck and leftover bread. No, Emmanuel agreed. You can't. And you'll be there? When the crowds come, when they start asking questions I don't know how to answer, every step of the way. Maya stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She walked to the edge of their shelter and looked out at the city spreading below them, lights beginning to emerge as the storm clouds cleared. Somewhere out there, people were already talking about what had happened tonight. Word would spread. By morning, there would be no hiding. She turned back to Emmanuel, who had remained seated but was watching her with an expression of profound patience, as if he'd wait forever for her decision. David used to say that brave knights never fought alone, she said. They always had their princess watching over them. Emmanuel smiled, and princesses never cooked alone either. They always had their brave knights protecting them. Maya felt the last of her resistance crumble. The fear was still there, would probably always be there, but underneath it, something else was growing. Purpose. The sense that every terrible thing that had brought her to this moment had been leading somewhere after all. She took a deep breath and stepped across the threshold from her old life into the unknown. Okay, she whispered, then stronger. Okay, let's feed them. The next morning arrived with a kind of crystalline clarity that only follows a storm. Maya woke before dawn, her body accustomed to the rhythms of street survival, but everything felt different now. The air seemed charged with possibility and threat in equal measure. Emmanuel was already awake, sitting cross-legged at the edge of their shelter, watching the sun paint Jerusalem's ancient stones in shades of gold and amber. He turned as she stirred, his expression peaceful but alert. "They're coming," he said simply. Maya's stomach clenched. She could hear it now. Voices in the distance, growing closer. Not just one or two people, but many, the sound of footsteps echoing off concrete, the murmur of excitement and expectation that crowds carried like a living thing. "How many?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. "More than last night. Word has spread." She scrambled to her feet, panic fluttering in her chest like a caged bird. Through the gaps between shipping containers, she could see them coming, a river of people flowing through the industrial district. Some she recognized from the night before, but there were dozens of new faces, and not all of them looked friendly. "There," Emmanuel pointed toward the far edge of the approaching crowd. "Do you see them?" Maya squinted and felt her blood run cold. 3 people in expensive coats walking slightly apart from the rest, their posture different, predatory rather than hopeful. The woman in the center held something that glinted in the morning light, a camera, Maya realized, or recording equipment. "Reporters," she breathed. "Among others." Emmanuel's voice carried a warning. "The tall man with the silver hair, he's connected to your old social services case. Someone called him." Maya's legs nearly gave out. She gripped the edge of a shipping container for support, memories of sterile offices and probing questions flooding back. "I have to run. I have to go now, before they—" "Look again," Emmanuel said softly. "Look at who else is here." Reluctantly, Maya forced herself to focus on the crowd again. Gradually, she began to notice other figures moving through the mass of people with purpose. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes was helping an elderly man navigate the uneven ground. A teenager with paint-stained fingers was carrying a heavy bag while walking beside someone in a wheelchair. A young mother with tired eyes was gently correcting her children's excited chatter about the miracle lady. "I don't understand," Maya whispered. "Mrs. Chen," Emmanuel said, nodding toward the woman helping the elderly man. "She runs the community kitchen 3 blocks from here. She's been looking for you for months, ever since someone told her about a girl who could make 2 cans of soup feed a dozen people." Maya's eyes widened. She remembered Mrs. Chen, had stolen food from behind her kitchen twice, had always felt guilty about it. "And Marcus," Emmanuel continued, indicating the teenager with paint-stained fingers. "He's been asking around about cooking lessons. His grandmother is sick, and he wants to learn how to make her feel better. How do you know all this?" Emmanuel's smile held secrets she was only beginning to glimpse. "The same way I knew about your dreams. Some knowledge comes from watching. Some comes from caring enough to see what others miss." The crowd was closer now, close enough that Maya could make out individual voices, but what she heard wasn't the aggressive questioning she'd feared. Instead, there were whispers of gratitude, gentle debates about what to bring as offerings, parents explaining to children about kindness and sharing. "They're not all here to take from you," Emmanuel said, reading her thoughts. "Most of them want to give. They want to be part of something beautiful. But the reporters will ask their questions, and you'll answer what you choose to answer when you choose to answer it." His voice carried absolute certainty. "You're not the frightened child who was dragged through investigations 5 years ago. You're not even the girl who lived in hiding for 3 years. You're something new now, something they've never encountered." Maya watched the silver-haired man from social services arguing with someone near the back of the crowd, a woman in chef's whites who was pointing emphatically back toward the main road, as if telling him to leave. Other people were beginning to notice the tension, forming a protective barrier without even realizing it. "They're—" Maya started, then stopped, amazed. "They're protecting me, people I've never met." "The first rule of your new world," Emmanuel said, standing and brushing dust from his clothes. "Love creates more love. What you gave last night is already multiplying, coming back to shelter you when you need it most." The crowd had reached the entrance to their small shelter. Maya could see faces now, hopeful, curious, grateful. Mrs. Chen was at the front, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables. Marcus held a sign that read "Thank you" in careful letters. The young mother's children clutched hand-drawn pictures. Maya's fear didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else. Not the paralyzing terror of exposure, but the sharp awareness of responsibility. These people had come seeking something she might be able to give them. The question wasn't whether she was ready. The question was whether she was brave enough to try. Maya stepped forward into the morning light, her bare feet finding purchase on the cold concrete as the crowd caught sight of her. A ripple of recognition passed through the gathered people, some pointing, others falling quiet, all of them pressing closer with an energy that made her skin prickle with electricity. "There she is," someone whispered, and the words carried like wind through wheat. Mrs. Chen broke from the front of the group, her weathered hands clutching the basket of vegetables so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Child," she called out, her accent thick with emotion, "I brought you these, fresh from the market this morning." She set the basket down at Maya's feet, like an offering at an altar. "I wanted to apologize. For all those times I should have helped instead of just calling the police when I stole from you," Maya finished quietly. The admission hung between them, honest and sharp. "When you were surviving," Mrs. Chen corrected fiercely. "When you were doing what you had to do, and I was too blind to see that what you needed wasn't punishment. It was a chance." Behind her, Marcus stepped forward with his careful sign, his teenage bravado cracking to reveal something vulnerable underneath. "My grandmother, she's forgetting things, forgetting me sometimes. But yesterday, after I told her about the soup, about what people were saying happened here, she smiled. First time in weeks." His voice dropped. Would you teach me? How to cook something that might bring her back, even if it's just for a little while?" Maya felt her chest constrict. These weren't demands or accusations, they were pleas for hope. Each person in the crowd carried their own burden, their own desperate need for the impossible thing they believed she might provide. But at the edges of the gathering she could see the others. The silver-haired man from social services had pushed past the woman in chef's whites and was making his way through the crowd with bureaucratic determination. The reporter held her camera high, trying to get clear shots over people's heads. A man in an expensive suit was talking rapidly into his phone, the words "media rights" and "exclusive access" floating over the general murmur. Emmanuel appeared at her shoulder, his presence both steadying and challenging. "What do you see when you look at them?" he asked quietly. Maya studied the approaching faces, the hopeful and the predatory, the grateful and the opportunistic. "I see people who want something from me. Some of them want healing, others want—" She paused, watching the reporter elbow past an elderly woman with a walker. "Others want to consume me, and which ones will you feed?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She'd been thinking in terms of all or nothing, either hide from everyone or expose herself to everyone. But Emmanuel was suggesting something else entirely. "I can choose," she said slowly, the realization dawning like sunrise. "You can choose," he confirmed. "The gift doesn't belong to them, it belongs to you, and you decide how to share it." The social services man was close enough now that Maya could see his face. Professional skepticism mixed with something that looked like recognition. He was studying her features, probably comparing them to photographs in whatever file he'd brought. In minutes, he'd be close enough to speak, to ask questions, to demand answers she wasn't ready to give. But between him and her stood Mrs. Chen with her offering of vegetables, Marcus with his grandmother's fading memory, the young mother whose children had drawn pictures of steaming bowls surrounded by smiling stick figures. These people weren't here to take. They were here to participate in something larger than themselves. Maya felt something crystallize inside her, hard and bright as a diamond formed under pressure. She thought of David, of the promises they'd made in the darkness of their shared room. She thought of Princess Maya in her enchanted kitchen, feeding anyone who came to her door with hunger in their hearts. And she made her choice. "Mrs. Chen," she said, loud enough for the nearest people to hear, "those vegetables, would you help me prepare them? I'll need someone who knows how to make a little go a long way." The elderly woman's face lit up like sunrise. "Of course, child, of course." "Marcus," Maya continued, her voice growing stronger, "bring your grandmother here, tomorrow, when the light is good. I'll teach you how to cook memories." A cheer went up from the crowd, not loud but deep and genuine. People began pressing forward, not aggressively but with purpose, pulling out their own small offerings: bread, fruit, bottles of water, packets of spices. The silver-haired man had stopped walking, clearly confused by the scene unfolding before him. This wasn't the vulnerable, isolated miner he'd expected to find. This was something else entirely. A young woman surrounded by community, supported by people who saw her not as a victim or a curiosity, but as a bridge to their own transformation. Maya caught Emmanuel's eye. He nodded once, approval and pride radiating from his expression. The real test was just beginning. The reporter pushed through the protective circle of supporters with predatory determination, her camera already rolling. "Miss Ashworth," she called out, her voice cutting through the gentle murmur of the gathered crowd like a blade. "Channel 7 News. Our viewers want to know about these alleged miracles. Can you demonstrate your abilities on camera?" Maya's hands stilled on the vegetables Mrs. Chen had brought. The intimate circle she'd been building, the careful selection of who would share in whatever was about to happen, suddenly felt fragile as spun glass. "I'm not performing tricks," Maya said quietly, not looking up from the carrots she'd been washing in a plastic bowl. "But surely you understand people's curiosity," the reporter pressed, stepping closer despite Marcus's attempt to block her path. "Claims of supernatural cooking, food that supposedly heals emotional trauma. These are extraordinary allegations that require extraordinary proof." The silver-haired man from social services used the distraction to slide closer, his official badge glinting in the morning sun. "Maya Ashworth," he said, his voice carrying the weight of bureaucratic authority. "I'm Jonathan Pierce from Child Protective Services. We need to talk about your living situation. A minor cannot simply exist outside the system indefinitely." Maya felt the walls closing in, the same suffocating sensation she'd experienced in those sterile offices years ago when adults with clipboards and serious expressions had dissected her tragedy with clinical detachment. Her breathing became shallow, her vision tunneling until all she could see were the accusing faces, the demanding eyes, the cameras waiting to capture her failure. "She's not alone," Mrs. Chen said firmly, moving to stand beside Maya. "She has community. She has people who care about her." "Community doesn't provide legal guardianship," Pierce replied dismissively. "Community doesn't ensure proper education, health care, or safety oversight. The girl needs to be in the system. The system failed her before," Marcus shot back, his teenage voice cracking with indignation. "Maybe the system isn't the answer." The reporter swiveled her camera toward him. "And you are?" "Someone who believes in something bigger than your ratings," Marcus said, his paint-stained fingers clenched into fists. Emmanuel had been silent through this confrontation, but Maya could feel his presence like an anchor in a storm. When she finally dared to look up from the vegetables, she found him watching not the arguing adults, but her, waiting, patient, ready to support whatever choice she made. "Stop," Maya said, her voice barely above a whisper. No one heard her over the growing argument. Pierce was citing regulations while the reporter bombarded him with questions about previous cases. More people were pressing forward, some to defend Maya, others drawn by the scent of conflict like carrion birds to roadkill. "Stop," Maya said again, louder this time. The authority in her voice surprised even her. Conversations died mid-sentence. The reporter's camera swung back toward her. Pierce straightened his tie and prepared to assert his bureaucratic dominance. Maya stood slowly, Mrs. Chen's vegetables still clutched in her dirt-stained hands. She could feel her old instincts screaming at her to run, to disappear into the maze of shipping containers and abandoned buildings where officials couldn't follow. But something else was rising inside her, the same power she'd felt last night when impossible things had become possible through simple acts of love. "You want proof?" she said, looking directly at the camera. You want to turn this into a spectacle for people's entertainment? The public has a right to know, the reporter began. The public has a right to nothing, Maya cut her off. These people, she gestured to Mrs. Chen, to Marcus, to the young mother with her children, they came here seeking hope. They came offering their own gifts, their own stories, their own need to be part of something beautiful, and you want to turn it into a circus. Pierce stepped forward. Miss Ashworth, regardless of these philosophical debates, you still need to come with me. There are procedures. The word hung in the air like a challenge. Maya could feel the weight of every gaze, the held breath of the crowd, the electric tension of a moment balanced on a knife's edge. I'm 17 years old, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. I've been surviving on my own for 3 years. I've fed hungry people, found shelter in storms, and learned to trust my own judgment about who deserves my care and who doesn't. She held up the vegetables, simple carrots and onions transformed into something sacred by intention and community. If you want to see what I can do, you'll do it on my terms. Mrs. Chen and Marcus and the others, they stay. You, she looked directly at the camera, can film what happens next. But you can't direct it, you can't control it, and if you don't like what you see, you can leave. The silence stretched until it became its own kind of answer. Your choice, Maya said, kneeling back down beside the vegetables, her hands steady despite the magnitude of what she'd just set in motion. The silence shattered when Pierce raised his radio to his lips. Unit 7, this is Pierce. I need backup at the Port Authority, Sector 12. We have a resistant miner refusing compliance. His voice carried the cold efficiency of someone accustomed to forcing cooperation through institutional power. Maya's hands trembled as the weight of his words hit her. Backup meant more officials, restraints, being dragged away while cameras rolled. It meant the end of everything she'd tried to build, the destruction of the fragile sanctuary where impossible things had bloomed in the darkness. You can't just call for reinforcements, Marcus protested, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. She's not doing anything wrong. She's an unaccompanied miner living in unsafe conditions, Pierce replied, clipping the radio back to his belt with practiced authority. This isn't a negotiation. The reporter stepped closer, scenting blood in the water. This is quite a development, a runaway teen with alleged supernatural abilities being taken into custody. Can you comment on how this fits into the larger pattern of youth homelessness in Jerusalem? Maya felt the world tilting around her. The vegetables in her hands, Mrs. Chen's offering, the foundation of what she'd hoped would be another miracle, suddenly felt like mockery. What good were her gifts against the machinery of bureaucracy? What power did love have against legal documents and institutional authority? Mrs. Chen moved closer, her weathered face creased with worry. Child, maybe you should go with them, Maya finished bitterly. Submit to the system that put me with families who locked me in basements and burned me with cigarettes? Trust the same people who told me my brother's death was an unfortunate outcome but not indicative of systemic failure? The words poured out like poison from an infected wound, 3 years of buried rage and grief erupting in front of strangers who'd come seeking healing. Several people in the crowd stepped back, shocked by the raw pain in her voice. The camera captured every moment, turning her breakdown into content. Emmanuel remained motionless, watching with those ancient eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul. For the first time since she'd met him, his expression was unreadable. "Where are you?" Maya whispered to him, desperate for the guidance he'd provided before. "Help me, please." But Emmanuel said nothing. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, as sirens began wailing in the distance. "They're coming," Pierce said with satisfaction. "My advice, Miss Ashworth, is to cooperate fully. Resistance will only make this harder." Maya's breath came in short gasps. The protective circle of supporters was fracturing, some people melting away at the first sound of authority, others looking uncertain about whether they should intervene. The reporter was narrating into her microphone about dramatic developments and authorities closing in. She thought of David, of his absolute faith that Princess Maya could save anyone who needed saving. She thought of the promises whispered in foster home darkness, the dreams of kitchens where love could transform scraps into feasts for anyone who hungered. All of it crumbling because she'd been foolish enough to believe she could stand against a system designed to devour people like her. "I can't," she said, the vegetables falling from her shaking hands to scatter across the concrete. "I can't do this. I'm not what you think I am. I'm not some miracle worker or saint or whatever story you've built in your heads. I'm just a broken girl who got lucky with some soup." The crowd's energy shifted, hope curdling into disappointment. She could see it in their faces, the realization that she was just another damaged teenager after all, that their dreams of transformation had been pinned to someone too fragile to bear the weight. Marcus's carefully painted sign fluttered to the ground as his shoulders slumped. Mrs. Chen's basket of vegetables sat abandoned, a monument to faith that had proven misplaced. Even the children who'd drawn pictures of steaming bowls looked confused and afraid. The sirens were getting closer. Maya searched Emmanuel's face desperately, looking for the certainty that had carried her through the night, but his expression remained neutral, waiting for what she couldn't understand. "Say something," she pleaded. "Tell them who you are. Show them what you showed me." Emmanuel tilted his head slightly, studying her with the same intensity he'd brought to examining the fish and bread. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft enough that only she could hear. "What I showed you," he said quietly, "was who you are, not who I am." The first police car rounded the corner of the shipping container, its lights painting the gathered crowd in alternating shades of red and blue. Pierce straightened his tie and prepared to take custody of another runaway, another file to be processed and forgotten. Maya closed her eyes and felt everything she'd dared to hope for slip through her fingers like water. The police car's engine cut off, leaving only the settling tick of cooling metal and the whisper of wind through the shipping containers. Maya kept her eyes closed, waiting for the inevitable. Handcuffs, readings of rights she'd memorized from previous encounters, the back seat that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. But the expected rough hands never came. "Maya?" The voice was familiar but impossible. Maya's eyes snapped open to see a woman emerging from the passenger seat of the police car. Not an officer, but someone in civilian clothes. Someone with graying brown hair and laugh lines around eyes that had haunted Maya's dreams for 3 years. "Sarah?" Maya whispered. Sarah Chen, no relation to the elderly Mrs. Chen despite the shared name, approached slowly, her hands visible and empty. She was older than Maya remembered, wearing the careful composure of someone who'd learned to navigate institutional bureaucracies without losing her humanity. "I've been looking for you for so long," Sarah said softly. When the reports started coming in about a teenage girl performing miracles with food, her voice broke slightly. "I knew it had to be you." The crowd watched in confused silence as Maya struggled to process this impossible reunion. Sarah had been her caseworker during those first terrible months after the fire, the only adult who'd seemed to see Maya as more than a damaged case file, the only one who'd listened when Maya tried to explain about her cooking, about the way food became something sacred when she prepared it with love. "You disappeared," Maya said, anger and hurt warring in her voice. "You promised you'd find me a good family, and then you just vanished." Sarah's face crumpled with guilt. "I got reassigned. Budget cuts, bureaucratic reshuffling. They moved me to a different department. I fought to keep your case, but—" She gestured helplessly. "The system failed you. I failed you." Pierce stepped forward impatiently. "This is highly irregular. Miss Chen, your emotional involvement could compromise." "My emotional involvement," Sarah cut him off with steel in her voice, "is the only reason we found her before she disappeared completely. And according to my research, Maya turns 18 in 6 weeks. Hardly an emergency requiring immediate intervention." Emmanuel moved closer to Maya, not speaking but radiating the same steady presence that had anchored her through the chaos of the last 2 days. For the first time, she noticed how he was watching Sarah, not with the neutral observation he'd shown everyone else, but with something that looked almost like approval. 6 weeks, Maya repeated, the words tasting like freedom and terrifying responsibility in equal measure. And then what? Then you get to choose, Sarah said simply. But maybe we can use these 6 weeks to help you build something real, something sustainable. She gestured to the scattered crowd, to Mrs. Chen still clutching her vegetables, to Marcus standing protectively near his fallen sign. These people, they didn't come here because they thought you were some kind of supernatural curiosity. They came because they recognized something true in what you offered. The reporter raised her camera again, but Sarah spun toward her with professional authority. This conversation is not for public consumption. You can report that the minor in question is receiving appropriate support and services, but any footage of this interaction will be considered exploitation of a vulnerable youth. Maya felt something shift inside her chest. Not the wild desperation that had driven her breakdown moments before, but something steadier, more rooted. Emmanuel had said she could choose who to feed, but she'd been thinking too small. The choice wasn't just about food, it was about trust, about vulnerability, about allowing others to care for her while she learned to care for herself. Sarah, she said slowly, there's something I need to show you, something I think you might understand. She knelt and began gathering the scattered vegetables with hands that no longer shook. Mrs. Chen immediately joined her, followed by Marcus, then the young mother and her children. Even some of the people who'd stepped back during the confrontation began to return, drawn by the shift in energy. I need a fire, Maya said, looking up at the assembled faces. Something we can cook over. Something that brings us together instead of driving us apart. Emmanuel smiled, the first time she'd seen that expression cross his features, and began gathering driftwood from the edges of the pier. Others joined him, building something communal and warm in the space that had moments before felt like a battlefield. As Maya watched the circle reform around a different kind of purpose, she finally understood what Emmanuel had been trying to tell her. The miracle wasn't in her hands or in mysterious transformations of food. The miracle was in choosing to believe that broken things could be made whole, not through magic, but through the simple, revolutionary act of people deciding to care for each other. The real feast was just beginning. The fire caught quickly, driftwood crackling with the salt-sweet scent of ocean memories. Maya knelt beside it, Sarah's familiar presence at her shoulder like an echo from a different life, one where caseworkers had names instead of badge numbers, where someone had actually listened when she'd tried to explain about the cooking. I remember, Sarah said quietly, watching Maya sort through the vegetables with practiced efficiency. The first family placement. You were so angry, but then you made pancakes for their youngest daughter, the one with the nightmares. Her mother called me, said it was the first time in months the child had slept through the night. Maya's hands stilled on a bruised tomato. You believed me? Even then? I believed there was something special about you. Whether it was the cooking or just your capacity for love, I wasn't sure it mattered. Sarah's voice carried 3 years of regret. I should have fought harder when they transferred me, should have found a way to keep track of you. Emmanuel settled cross-legged beside the fire, Marcus on his other side. The teenager was sketching again, his earlier painted sign forgotten in favor of capturing the new constellation of faces around the flames. Mrs. Chen had claimed a spot near Maya, her weathered hands preparing vegetables with the unconscious rhythm of decades. This is what I was trying to tell you, Emmanuel said, his voice barely audible above the fire's whisper. The answer was never in the mystery of what you could do. It was in the choice to do it anyway. Maya nodded, understanding flooding through her like water finding its natural course for 3 years she'd been running. From the system, from her past, from the terrifying responsibility of being someone others might depend on. But here, surrounded by people who'd chosen to stay despite the chaos, despite the cameras and officials and institutional machinery grinding around them, she finally felt solid ground beneath her feet. 6 weeks, she said, testing the words. We have 6 weeks to figure this out. Figure what out? Marcus asked, looking up from his sketch. Maya gestured to encompass the circle. Mrs. Chen's quiet competence, Marcus's fierce loyalty, the young mother who'd returned with her children despite the earlier conflict, the handful of others who'd weathered the storm of bureaucratic intervention. How to make this real, she said. How to build something that doesn't depend on me being some kind of miracle worker. Something that can grow. Sarah leaned forward, her caseworker instincts engaging. You're talking about creating an actual support network. Resources, structure, sustainability. I'm talking about family, Maya corrected gently. The kind that chooses each other. She began dicing onions, their sharp scent mingling with wood smoke. Her movements carried new certainty, not the desperate efficiency of someone cooking to survive, but the deliberate grace of someone preparing a meal for people she cared about. Mrs. Chen added her vegetables to Maya's pile, their hands working in synchronized harmony. My grandson, she said suddenly. He has a food truck. Needs help, can't afford to pay much, but there's a small apartment above his restaurant, empty for months. Marcus looked up sharply. You mean like a real job? With an actual kitchen? Part-time at first, Mrs. Chen continued, watching Maya's reaction carefully. But Tommy, he understands about feeding people who are hungry for more than food. His truck parks in 3 different neighborhoods, places where people need hope as much as meals. Sarah pulled out her phone, already shifting into problem-solving mode. We'd need to verify the working conditions, ensure appropriate supervision for a minor, arrange for educational continuity. Sarah, Maya interrupted softly. Breathe. The caseworker stopped mid-sentence, a surprised laugh escaping her. Sorry. Old habits. Emmanuel fed another piece of driftwood to the fire, sending sparks dancing into the grey morning sky. Roots grow slowly, he observed, but they grow stronger when they're not forced. Maya began sautéing the vegetables in Mrs. Chen's battered pot, the familiar alchemy of heat and intention working its quiet magic. But this time, she wasn't cooking alone. Marcus helped tend the fire, Mrs. Chen seasoned with the confidence of decades. Sarah organized plates and utensils with bureaucratic efficiency, transformed into care. Even the reporter, who'd been maintaining a respectful distance since Sarah's intervention, seemed drawn into the circle's gravity. She'd lowered her camera, watching with human curiosity rather than professional hunger. This is the plan? Maya asked, stirring slowly as flavors married and deepened. 6 weeks to build something real, a job, an apartment, a chosen family that doesn't disappear when the system decides to shuffle papers. It's a beginning, Sarah said. The rest we figure out as we go. Maya tasted the simple stew, vegetables transformed not by supernatural intervention, but by patience, community, and the revolutionary act of believing broken things could be made whole. It was perfect in its imperfection, miraculous in its ordinary humanity. She looked around the circle of faces illuminated by firelight, each one changed by the choice to stay, to hope, to build something together. For the first time in 3 years, Maya wasn't running towards something or away from something. She was exactly where she belonged. The stew finished cooking as morning light strengthened over the harbor, but none of them moved to break the circle. Maya ladled portions into mismatched bowls, watching steam rise like small prayers into the crisp air. This was the moment she'd grown to treasure, the hushed anticipation before the first taste, when hope hung suspended between hunger and satisfaction. But as she handed Sarah the first bowl, Maya felt something shift in the quality of silence around them, not the peaceful quiet of shared anticipation, but the charged stillness that preceded storms. Emmanuel's head turned sharply toward the main road. In the distance, Maya caught the sound of multiple engines, the deliberate progression of official vehicles moving with purpose. Pierce must have called for backup. They're coming back, Marcus said, his sketch forgotten as he scrambled to his feet. Sarah's expression hardened with professional recognition. More than just Pierce this time. That sounds like a full intervention team. The fragile peace they'd built around the fire suddenly felt as ephemeral as the steam rising from their bowls. Maya's hand tightened on the ladle as 3 years of institutional memories crashed over her. The midnight removals, the emergency interventions that scattered whatever stability she'd managed to create. 6 weeks was too good to be true, she said bitterly. They'll find some regulation I'm violating, some technicality that requires immediate action. Emmanuel stood slowly, brushing sand from his clothes. For the first time since Maya had met him, he looked not peaceful but purposeful, in a way that made the air around him seem to thicken with significance. "Maya," he said quietly, "do you trust what we've built here?" She looked around the circle, at Mrs. Chen calmly continuing to eat her stew despite the approaching threat, at Marcus clutching his sketchbook like a shield, at Sarah, whose jaw was set with the determination of someone who'd lost Maya once and wouldn't allow it to happen again. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "But trust doesn't stop them from having legal authority. Legal authority," Emmanuel mused, "isn't the only kind of power that matters." The vehicles were closer now. Maya could make out at least 3 cars, possibly more. Whatever Pierce had reported about their morning confrontation had clearly prompted a significant response. She felt the familiar panic beginning to claw at her chest, the instinct to run that had kept her alive for 3 years, screaming at her to abandon everything and disappear into the maze of shipping containers. Sarah moved closer, her phone already in her hand. "I have contacts," she said rapidly, "supervisors who trust my judgment. If I can buy us some time—" "No," Maya said, surprising them both. She set down the ladle and stood, facing the direction of the approaching engines. "I'm done hiding, done running. If they want to destroy this, they'll have to do it in front of everyone." Marcus grinned fiercely. "Hell yes. Let them try to explain to the news cameras why they're breaking up a community meal." The reporter, who had indeed been filming from a respectful distance, straightened with renewed professional interest. Other people around the harbor were beginning to notice the commotion. Dock workers pausing in their morning routines, early joggers slowing to observe the developing situation. Emmanuel approached Maya, his presence radiating the same steady calm that had anchored her through her darkest moments. But now she understood that the calm hadn't been for her benefit. It had been teaching her to find that steadiness within herself. "What you began here," he said softly, "cannot be undone by bureaucracy or force. The connections you've forged, the hope you've kindled, these things have their own momentum now." Maya nodded, feeling truth settle into her bones. The past 3 years had taught her that institutions could scatter her belongings, relocate her body, shuffle her through systems designed to process rather than nurture. But they couldn't erase the fact that she'd fed Mrs. Chen's grandchildren, couldn't undo Marcus's fierce loyalty or Sarah's determination to build bridges between bureaucracy and compassion. The first official vehicle rounded the corner of the shipping containers, not just Pierce this time, but a van marked with the logos of multiple agencies. Maya could see figures emerging, clipboards and cameras, and the grim efficiency of a system mobilizing to contain what it couldn't understand. She turned back to the circle around the fire, to the people who'd chosen to stay despite the approaching storm. "Whatever happens," Maya said clearly, her voice carrying across the assembled faces, "remember this. Remember that we chose each other. Remember that broken things can be made whole." The ladle felt steady in her hand as she lifted it again, serving the remaining portions with deliberate care. If this was to be their last meal together, she would make it perfect. The final confrontation was coming, but Maya Ashworth was no longer running toward it or away from it. She was ready. The official convoy approached like a slow-moving storm, but Maya didn't flinch. She continued serving, each portion ladled with deliberate grace, while bureaucratic machinery assembled around them. Pierce emerged from the lead vehicle, flanked by social workers, housing officials, and what appeared to be a police liaison, enough institutional authority to flatten any resistance through sheer overwhelming force. But something had changed in the 30 minutes since Pierce's first retreat. Word had spread through the harbor's invisible networks, and Maya watched with growing amazement as people materialized from the morning mist. Dock workers set down their tools and walked toward the fire. The coffee cart vendor wheeled her setup closer. Joggers slowed, then stopped, then joined the expanding circle. "Miss Ashworth," Pierce called out, his voice carrying crisp official certainty. "We have court orders authorizing immediate protective custody. You need to come with us now." Sarah stepped forward, her phone pressed to her ear, speaking rapidly to someone with apparent authority. Maya caught fragments: minor approaching majority, established support network, precipitous action, but she kept her attention focused on the bowls in her hands, on the faces around the fire who had chosen to stay. Mrs. Chen rose slowly, her weathered frame somehow radiating unshakable dignity. "This child," she said clearly, her accent thickening with emotion, "feeds my grandchildren when they are hungry, teaches them kindness. You want to arrest kindness?" Marcus jumped to his feet, sketchbook clutched against his chest like armor. "She's not some runaway criminal. She's building community here, real community." The reporter had moved into position with professional efficiency, camera rolling as more officials emerged from their vehicles. Maya realized with sudden clarity that this moment was being documented, broadcast, made permanent in ways that transcended any single institutional decision. Emmanuel remained seated by the fire, but his presence seemed to expand outward like ripples on still water. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the growing crowd. "Interesting," he said mildly, "how institutions so often mobilize to destroy what they cannot control." Pierce's jaw tightened. "Mr. Names matter less than actions," Emmanuel replied, "and these actions speak quite clearly about priorities." Maya felt something crystallize inside her chest, not defiance exactly, but a profound understanding of her own worth that had nothing to do with official validation. She set down the ladle and walked directly toward Pierce, her movement steady and deliberate. "Officer Pierce," she said formally, "I understand your concerns about my welfare, but I need you to look around before you make your next decision." She gestured to encompass the circle that had grown from 6 people to nearly 30 in the span of minutes. "These people didn't come here because someone mandated it. They came because we built something real together, something that feeds more than bodies." A young mother from the expanded crowd called out, "My daughter asks about the cooking girl every day, when we can come back to eat with everyone." Another voice, "She helped my nephew when he was sleeping rough, first adult who listened without judgment." Sarah ended her phone call and approached the assembled officials with bureaucratic authority reinvented as fierce advocacy. "I've spoken with my supervisor and the family court liaison. Given the minor's age and demonstrated stability, immediate removal requires justification beyond general welfare concerns." Pierce consulted his clipboard with visible frustration. "Reports indicate she's been living without adequate shelter, engaging in unlicensed food service." "Reports indicate," Sarah interrupted smoothly, "that she's created a support network and community resource. My professional recommendation is supervised transition planning over the remaining 6 weeks until majority, not emergency intervention." Maya watched the standoff develop, understanding that her fate was being negotiated by people with good intentions but competing priorities. The familiar helplessness began to creep up her throat, 3 years of having decisions made about her life without her meaningful participation. But then Emmanuel stood, moving through the crowd with quiet purpose, until he reached Maya's side. He didn't speak to the officials or attempt to insert himself into their bureaucratic calculations. Instead, he addressed the assembled community directly. "Maya," he said, his voice carrying the weight of profound certainty, "show them what you've really been building here." She understood immediately. This wasn't about defending herself to institutional authority or proving her worthiness to systems designed to process rather than nurture. This was about demonstrating the reality they'd created together, the bonds that transcended official recognition, the love that operated outside bureaucratic approval. Maya walked back to the fire and picked up the ladle one more time. But instead of serving food, she began speaking to each person in the circle, naming what they'd given her and what she'd learned from them. Mrs. Chen's patient wisdom, Marcus's fierce loyalty, Sarah's determination to bridge worlds, the young mother's trust, the dock worker's protective presence. As she spoke, Maya realized that Pierce's intervention had inadvertently created the perfect test. Everything she'd learned about chosen family, about sustainable community, about her own worth, it was all here, visible and unshakable, in the faces of people who had chosen to stay. The real question wasn't whether institutions would recognize what they'd built. The question was whether what they'd built was strong enough to survive institutional interference. Maya looked around the circle one more time, then directly at Pierce. "I'm ready for your decision," she said clearly, "but this community isn't going anywhere." Pierce's face reddened as he stepped forward, his clipboard raised like a weapon. "This ends now. Maya Ashworth, you're coming into protective custody whether you cooperate or not." He gestured sharply to the police liaison, who began moving toward Maya with practiced efficiency. The crowd stirred uneasily, but Maya stood perfectly still, her eyes locked on Pierce's face. In that moment, she saw something that made her breath catch, not just bureaucratic determination, but something deeper and more personal. Fear. "You're afraid of me," she said quietly, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "Not because I'm dangerous, but because you can't categorize what I do." Pierce's step faltered. "Don't be ridiculous. This is about control," Maya interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "About a system that can't tolerate anything it doesn't create and manage itself." Emmanuel moved closer, his presence radiating that familiar calm authority. But when he spoke, his words carried an edge Maya had never heard before, not anger exactly, but something far more unsettling. "Tell me, Officer Pierce," Emmanuel said softly, "when did you stop believing that broken things could be made whole?" Pierce whirled toward him, clipboard trembling in his grip. "Who the hell do you think you are? Some vagrant philosopher who's been filling this girl's head with— Answer the question." The two words fell into the morning air like stones into still water. The crowd fell silent. Even the harbor sounds seemed to fade as Pierce found himself trapped in Emmanuel's steady gaze. Pierce started, then stopped. His face cycled through confusion, anger, and something that looked dangerously like recognition. "I don't have to justify—" "8 years ago," Emmanuel continued, his voice carrying impossible knowledge, "you had a daughter. Addicted, homeless, angry at every attempt to help her. You tried everything: treatment centers, interventions, tough love, unconditional support. Nothing worked." Pierce went white. "How could you possibly—" "She died in an alley 3 blocks from here, alone. And you decided that people like her, people like Maya, were problems to be solved rather than human beings to be loved." The clipboard slipped from Pierce's nerveless fingers, hitting the sand with a soft thud. Maya watched in horror and fascination as the man who'd seemed so certain, so immovably official, began to crumble before her eyes. "She chose drugs over family," Pierce whispered. "Over everything we tried to give her. How was I supposed to—" "You were supposed to keep believing in her worth," Emmanuel said gently, "even when she couldn't believe in it herself." Sarah stepped forward, her professional mask slipping to reveal raw compassion. "Officer Pierce, if you lost a child, then you understand what Maya's been through. She lost her entire family, but instead of letting it destroy her, she's been feeding other people's children. Don't punish her for surviving differently than you expected." Maya felt something shift inside her chest, not just understanding of Pierce's motivation, but recognition of her own deepest fear made manifest. This was what terrified her most, not institutional interference or bureaucratic machinery, but the possibility that her own brokenness might be too much for anyone to bear. That love, even chosen family, had limits that her damage would inevitably exceed. "You think I'm going to end up like your daughter?" she said to Pierce, the words coming from some deep well of insight she hadn't known she possessed. You think everyone who falls through the cracks is doomed to keep falling forever. Pierce looked at her with eyes bright with unshed tears. Aren't you? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Maya felt every person in the crowd waiting for her answer. Mrs. Chen's weathered face creased with patient wisdom, Marcus clutching his sketchbook, fierce loyalty warring with his own abandoned childhood. Sarah, who'd built bridges between bureaucracy and compassion despite every institutional obstacle. And Emmanuel, whose presence had taught her that broken things carried their own fierce beauty. Maybe, Maya said finally, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the admission. Maybe I am doomed to keep falling, but look around you. She gestured to the circle that had grown beyond any official recognition, to the faces of people who'd chosen connection despite every reason to remain isolated. Maybe the point isn't to stop falling. Maybe the point is to fall together and to catch each other when we can. Pierce stood frozen, his entire worldview cracking open like an egg. The other officials shifted uncomfortably, bureaucratic certainty dissolving in the face of something too human for their procedures to contain. Emmanuel approached Pierce with the same gentle purpose he'd shown Maya in her darkest moments. Your daughter's story isn't finished, he said softly. As long as you remember her with love instead of failure, as long as you choose compassion over control, she continues to matter. She continues to teach. Pierce's composure shattered completely. 3 years of suppressed grief poured out in harsh, broken sobs that echoed across the harbor like a prayer. Maya understood, finally, that this had never been about her at all. The sound of Pierce's grief hung in the salt air like a broken hymn, and Maya felt the precise moment when everything she'd built balanced on a knife's edge. The other officials stood frozen, their bureaucratic certainty crumbling in the face of their colleagues' raw humanity. The crowd pressed closer, protective but uncertain, while cameras captured every trembling second for a world that would judge their choices by tomorrow's headlines. Maya looked at Emmanuel, whose ancient eyes held depths she was only beginning to understand, and saw her answer reflected there with crystalline clarity. Victory wasn't going to come from defeating the system or proving her worth to institutional authority. Victory was going to require her to surrender the very thing she'd fought hardest to protect, her freedom. I'll come with you, Maya said quietly, her words cutting through Pierce's sobs like a blade through silk. The crowd erupted in protests. Marcus lunged forward, his loyalty blazing. Maya, no! You don't have to. She's found stability here, Sarah argued desperately, her professional composure fracturing. Removing her now serves no one's interests. But Maya raised her hand, and something in her expression commanded silence. She walked directly to Pierce, whose grief had left him defenseless and raw, and placed her fingers gently on his trembling shoulder. I'll come, she repeated, but not to be processed or managed or fixed. I'll come because someone needs to teach you and your system what it looks like to choose love over fear. She turned to face the assembled crowd, her chosen family, the people who had shown her that broken things could indeed be made whole. Mrs. Chen, will you keep the fire burning? The elderly woman nodded, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Every morning, child, until you come home. Marcus, Maya's voice caught on his name. Your sketches matter. Keep drawing truth, even when, especially when, it's uncomfortable for people to see. The boy clutched his notebook against his chest like a shield, his fierce young face twisted with incomprehension. This isn't fair. You built something real here. Yes, Maya said simply, and now it has to prove it can survive without me. Sarah stepped forward, her bureaucratic authority transformed into something far more personal. Maya, you're 6 weeks from majority, 6 weeks from legal independence. Don't sacrifice your future for... For what? Maya interrupted. For the possibility that someone else's daughter might not die alone in an alley? For the chance that Officer Pierce might learn to see homeless kids as human beings instead of problems to be solved? She looked around the circle one final time, memorizing faces that had become family, burning their love into her heart like a brand that no institution could erase. "This isn't sacrifice," she said, her voice carrying across the harbor with surprising strength. "This is investment, in him, in the system, in the possibility that 3 years from now, some other scared kid won't have to choose between safety and dignity." Emmanuel approached her, his presence radiating both profound sadness and unshakable pride. "You understand the cost?" Maya nodded. She understood perfectly. 6 weeks in institutional custody, 6 weeks of proving her stability to people trained to see pathology instead of resilience, 6 weeks of fighting for basic human dignity within systems designed to process rather than nurture, and the very real possibility that once inside, she might never find her way back to the freedom she'd carved from the city's margins. "But what if they don't learn?" Marcus demanded, his young voice breaking. "What if you give up everything and nothing changes?" Maya smiled, the expression radiating certainty that surprised even her. "Look around, Marcus. Do you see nothing changing?" Pierce had stopped sobbing and was staring at Maya with something approaching awe. The other officials shifted uncomfortably, their prepared interventions rendered useless by her willing cooperation. The crowd pressed closer, bearing witness to something their procedures had never anticipated. Sarah pulled out her phone with renewed determination. "If you're doing this, we're doing it right. Full documentation, regular check-ins and transition planning that actually serves your interests. I'm not letting you disappear into the system. We'll visit," Mrs. Chen said fiercely. "All of us. Every day they allow. I'll draw everything," Marcus promised, tears streaming down his face. "Every detail. So when you come back, it's all still here." Maya walked to the fire one last time and picked up the ladle, ladling the remaining stew into containers for people to take with them. Her movements were precise and graceful, each portion served with the same care she'd shown from the beginning. "Remember," she said as she worked, "we chose each other. That choice doesn't end because institutions intervene. Love doesn't stop because bureaucracy demands it." She set down the ladle and faced Pierce, whose tears had left his face raw but somehow cleaner. "I'm ready." As they walked toward the official vehicles, Maya understood that she wasn't giving up her freedom. She was transforming it into something larger than herself. The institutional van's engine hummed to life, but Maya barely heard it over the sound of her chosen family calling her name. Through the reinforced window, she watched Marcus break free from Mrs. Chen's restraining hand and sprint after the vehicle, his sketchbook clutched against his chest like a talisman. Sarah's official sedan followed close behind, emergency flashes cutting through the morning gloom as she documented everything with bureaucratic precision turned fierce advocacy. But it was Pierce's face in the rearview mirror that held Maya's attention. The man who'd arrived with clipboard certainty now stared at his hands as if they belonged to a stranger, his earlier authority replaced by something fragile and questioning. The other officials maintained professional silence, but she could feel their discomfort radiating through the van's cramped interior. 3 people trying to process what they'd witnessed, what they'd participated in, what it meant for procedures designed to manage rather than heal. "Your daughter," Maya said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them since leaving the harbor. "What was her name?" Pierce's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror with desperate hunger. "Jennifer. Jenna. She used to cook when she was little. Elaborate disasters that took hours to clean up, but she was so proud." His voice trailed off into memory, and Maya saw the precise moment when the connection crystallized in his mind. Another girl who cooked, another attempt at creating something beautiful from broken pieces. The parallel was too obvious to ignore, too painful to fully acknowledge. "She didn't choose drugs over family," Maya continued, her words gentle but uncompromising. "She chose what felt like survival in the moment. That's what we do when we're falling. We grab whatever seems solid, even when it isn't." The van pulled into the processing facility's parking lot, institutional grey concrete rising before them like a wall designed to separate rather than shelter. Maya had been in similar buildings before, knew the smell of disinfectant that never quite masked despair, the sound of doors that locked from only one side. Her stomach clenched with familiar dread, but underneath the fear lay something new, purpose that transcended self-preservation. Pierce walked beside her toward the entrance, his movements uncertain. "Maya, what you said about teaching us, about choosing love over fear, I don't know if I remember how to do that anymore." She stopped walking, forcing him to face her on the building's steps. Around them, other officials waited with varying degrees of patience, but Maya ignored them completely. This moment belonged to something larger than bureaucratic schedule. "Start small," she said. "Start with seeing the next kid as Jennifer instead of a case number. Start with asking what they need instead of assuming what they lack. Start with believing that broken doesn't mean worthless." Through the facility's glass doors, Maya could see the intake processing area, metal chairs bolted to linoleum floors, forms designed to reduce human complexity to checkable boxes, staff trained to maintain professional distance. Everything she'd spent 3 years learning to avoid, every system that had failed her when she needed safety most. But she also saw something else. Sarah's sedan pulling into a visitor parking space, emergency flashes still blazing like a promise. Through her phone screen, Maya caught glimpses of what was happening back at the harbour. Mrs. Chen tending the fire while a growing crowd gathered, Marcus showing his sketches to anyone who would look, people taking the containers of stew she'd prepared and carrying them into the city like communion. Emmanuel had not followed them here, but his presence lingered in the certainty that some transformations required descent before ascension, that love sometimes demanded the very surrender that seemed most impossible. "I need you to promise me something," Maya said to Pierce as they reached the entrance doors. "If this changes nothing, if you go back to seeing homeless kids as problems to be solved instead of people to be loved, then Jennifer's death means nothing. But if you can learn to believe in their worth even when they can't believe in it themselves." She let the sentence hang unfinished, watching Pierce wrestle with implications that would reshape everything he thought he knew about loss, about justice, about the possibility of redemption. The facility's doors opened with mechanical efficiency, releasing a wave of climate-controlled air that carried all the institutional smells Maya remembered. But she walked forward without hesitation, transforming each step into an act of faith, not in the system that would process her, but in the people who would remember what they'd witnessed, in the love that would outlast any bureaucratic procedure. Behind her, she heard Pierce's voice, changed and questioning, "How do I know if I'm doing it right?" Maya smiled without turning around. "When you stop asking how and start asking who, when you stop managing outcomes and start serving people." The intake doors closed behind them with bureaucratic finality, but Maya carried the harbor's fire in her chest like an ember that no institution could extinguish. The intake process unfolded with institutional predictability, forms to complete, questions to answer, belongings to catalogue and store. Maya moved through each requirement with calm cooperation that clearly unsettled the staff, who'd obviously prepared for resistance, rebellion, anything except willing participation in her own processing. But she answered every question honestly, signed every document they placed before her, submitted to every procedure with grace that transformed compliance into something approaching ceremony. 3 weeks passed in a blur of scheduled meals, supervised activities, and therapeutic sessions designed to identify her underlying pathologies. Maya attended everything, participated fully, and watched as her very stability began to confound people trained to find dysfunction. The facility's psychiatrist, Dr. Morrison, spent hours trying to unearth trauma responses that might justify her placement, only to discover resilience where he expected breakdown, wisdom where he anticipated anger. "Your caseworker reports unusual behavioral patterns," Dr. Morrison said during their final session, consulting notes that clearly frustrated him. "Specifically, you've been cooking?" Maya smiled from her regulation chair. "With whatever ingredients they'll allow. Cafeteria fruit, vegetables from the garden therapy program, nothing fancy, And distributing meals to other residents? Sharing food? It's different. Through the office window, Maya could see other kids in the common area, some of whom had begun gathering around her at meal times, not because institutional food required improvement, though it certainly did, but because something about the way she approached cooking, the attention she paid to their preferences, the care she invested in simple dishes, reminded them that they deserved more than mere sustenance. Dr. Morrison set down his clipboard with visible frustration. "Maya, I'm required to recommend ongoing placement or release based on stability assessments. In 3 years of practice, I've never encountered a case where a homeless miner demonstrated such functional coping mechanisms. Is that a problem?" "It's unprecedented." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with professional curiosity. "Most kids who've experienced your level of system failure present with attachment disorders, behavioral issues, academic deficits. You're reading above grade level, demonstrating emotional regulation that surpasses most adults and showing leadership qualities that—" He trailed off, as if the implications of his own assessment were too large to voice. "That what, Dr. Morrison? That suggests this placement serves administrative convenience rather than therapeutic necessity." Maya felt something shift in her chest, not surprise, but confirmation of what she'd suspected all along. "What happens now?" "Now, I write a report recommending immediate release to transitional housing with full emancipation support." Dr. Morrison's expression softened beyond professional boundaries. "Maya, whatever you learned living on the streets, whatever kept you functioning when everything else failed, it's remarkable. Don't let anyone convince you that survival is pathology." The release paperwork took 2 more days to process, during which Maya taught 3 other residents basic cooking techniques and helped one girl write a letter to the grandmother she'd been separated from. When Sarah arrived with civilian clothes and a folder full of housing options, Maya felt ready to return to the world, but changed in ways that went deeper than institutional processing could measure. The ride back to the harbor passed in comfortable silence until Sarah finally spoke. "Pierce has been visiting the site every morning, bringing coffee for the breakfast volunteers, helping with setup. Mrs. Chen says he mostly listens." Maya nodded, unsurprised. "How's Marcus?" "Growing. His sketch series documenting homeless youth experiences is being featured in the community center gallery. He's been interviewing other kids, telling their stories through art. I think you'd be proud." The harbor came into view as they crested the hill, and Maya's breath caught. What had been her small circle around a single fire had expanded into something unrecognizable. 3 cooking stations operated under weathered tarps, staffed by volunteers she didn't know but whose movements carried familiar purpose. Gardens had sprouted in shipping containers, tended by people whose faces showed the same fierce care Mrs. Chen had always displayed. Children played on equipment that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago, while their parents participated in what looked like job training workshops. "Emmanuel?" she asked quietly. "Gone," Sarah admitted, "the day after you left. But people kept coming, kept bringing supplies, skills, stories. Whatever he started, it didn't need him to continue." Maya climbed out of the sedan and stood at the harbor's edge, watching her community thrive in her absence. Marcus spotted her first, abandoning his easel to run toward her with a whoop of pure joy. Mrs. Chen followed more slowly, her weathered face bright with welcome tears. Behind them came Pierce, his official uniform replaced with work clothes, his hands dirty from garden soil, his expression transformed by 3 weeks of learning to ask who instead of how. "Welcome home," Mrs. Chen said, embracing her with fierce gentleness. Maya looked around at faces both familiar and new, at the evidence of love multiplying beyond any single person's ability to contain it, and understood that she hadn't just returned to her world. She'd returned to help it become something better, the new beginning. 6 months later, Maya stood in the kitchen of the Harbor Community Center, a converted warehouse that had risen from the collective will of people who refused to let love remain temporary. Steam rose from industrial-sized pots while she supervised a dinner service that would feed 200 people. but the chaos felt like symphony now, each volunteer moving with practiced purpose through a dance they'd learned together. "Maya, the city council representatives are here," Sarah called from the dining area, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd fought bureaucracy into submission. What had begun as an illegal encampment had transformed into a registered non-profit, with Sarah as executive director, her government experience finally serving something larger than procedure. Through the service window, Maya could see the officials examining clipboards, while Mrs. Chen guided them past tables where formerly homeless families shared meals with volunteers from the university, where children completed homework while their parents attended evening classes in the adjoining rooms. The sight should have made her nervous. Inspectors still carried power to disrupt, but she felt only quiet pride. "They're not here to shut us down," Pierce said, appearing beside her with a tray of clean dishes. His transformation over the months had been remarkable to witness, the rigid certainty replaced by careful listening, the need to control replaced by willingness to serve. "They're here to learn how to replicate this in other districts." Maya ladled stew into serving bowls, her movements automatic after countless repetitions. "How many?" 12 cities so far. They want Marcus to document the process, create a manual for community development that starts with dignity instead of deficit. Pierce's voice carried wonder that hadn't diminished despite daily exposure to miracles. "Your surrender changed more than just us, Maya. It changed how people think about what's possible." She watched Marcus across the dining room, now 15 and taller, his sketchbook forgotten on the table, as he listened intently to an elderly man describing his experience transitioning from the streets to stable housing. The boy's fierce protective instincts had evolved into something more nuanced, still advocating fiercely for justice. But with patience, he'd learned from watching love work slowly through systems designed to resist it. "The new placement coordinator wants to meet you," Pierce continued. "Dr. Morrison recommended you for the advisory board overseeing foster care reform. Says your insights could prevent other kids from falling through the cracks." Maya paused in her ladling. The idea of returning to institutional settings still triggered muscle memory of locked doors and reduction to case numbers, but the invitation carried different weight now, not as someone seeking help, but as someone qualified to offer it. "Would you consider it?" Sarah joined them in the kitchen, her bureaucratic efficiency now channeled toward expanding rather than restricting possibilities. "The board meets monthly, consulting on policies affecting homeless youth. Your experience could influence how the system treats kids like you were." Like she was. Maya caught the past tense and realized how much had changed without her conscious awareness. She was no longer the girl who survived on scraps and slept in doorways, but she wasn't defined by rescue either. She'd become something entirely new, someone who remembered being broken and chose to help heal rather than simply escape. "I'll think about it," she said finally, returning to the rhythm of serving. Each bowl carried more than food. It carried attention, care, recognition of worth that transcended circumstance. The same intention Emmanuel had modeled, now multiplied through dozens of hands. The evening wound down with familiar ritual, volunteers cleaning while residents transitioned to evening activities, children finishing homework in the library corner while adults participated in support groups or job training. Maya moved through the space checking details, ensuring elderly residents had transportation home, confirming that families staying in the transitional housing units had everything they needed, reviewing tomorrow's volunteer schedule with Mrs. Chen. "He would be proud," Mrs. Chen said as they stood together in the quiet kitchen, referring to Emmanuel without needing to name him. His absence had become presence of a different kind, not the loss of guidance, but the internalization of it. You took what he gave and made it larger than any one person could carry. Maya smiled, washing the last of the serving dishes. "We all did. That was always the point, wasn't it? Not to need him, but to remember how to need each other." Outside, the harbor stretched dark and peaceful under city lights that no longer seemed cold. Marcus had convinced the city to install proper lighting around the community center, making the space safe for evening programming. Pierce's patrol route had been extended to include regular check-ins that felt more like family visits than law enforcement. As Maya locked the center's doors, she thought about tomorrow's planned expansion, a mobile kitchen that would bring meals to encampments the center couldn't yet reach, staffed by people who understood that dignity mattered more than efficiency, that some hungers could only be addressed by recognizing the humanity in everyone they served. She'd learned to transform scraps into sustenance, but she'd discovered something greater: how to transform surrender into service, how to transform suffering into sanctuary for others still searching for home. The girl who'd once believed she wasn't worth much had learned to help others discover their immeasurable value, and in teaching them, she'd finally learned her own.